This summer, we have covered 300 years of Middle East history. In some ways, this trek through the Book of the 12 has felt like a sprint, but I know for you, it's a marathon. For the last 2 weeks, we have dived deeply into Judah's call to rebuild Jerusalem. Haggai and Zechariah talk at length about this. And to round out our prophets today, so does Malachi, whoever he is. Malachi, the word itself means my messenger. We don't know who wrote this prophecy. It was a messenger. We call him Malachi. It's highly unlikely his name was Malachi. But that doesn't really matter, because what we do know is that he speaks words of salvation to a post-exilic Judah. In Malachi, unlike any of the other prophets, we hear the voices of both God and the people, and they're constantly questioning. There is a lot of questions. No other prophetic book is quite written like Malachi, and I think this matters. The whole prophecy is 55 verses long, and there are 22 questions. That's a lot. Most of them are cries of the people directing their fears and sadness to God. How have you loved us through all of this? How we have despised your name. We're so sorry. How have we plotted against you? How have we wearied you? How did we rob you? How have we spoken against you? And perhaps the most important question that we read a moment ago, how shall we return to you? These are deeply spiritual questions that show a people still searching to reconnect their pain to God. How shall we return to you? And maybe this is the best possible ending to the Old Testament. The whole work from Genesis to Malachi is a tragic tale of a called people who squander that calling. They sell their birthright for political power. They fumble their kingdom that's no longer to come. They're held captive to fear only to escape as a shadow of who they once were, forced to be dependent upon a God, dreaming of a world that just quite isn't yet. Have you ever thought about the Old Testament like this? As a tragedy? I think about this quite often. I think it mirrors our internal lives acutely. Every one of us lives a tragic spiritual tale. We are a called people who are made in the image of God, but we have squandered our spiritual abilities almost daily. We've sold our birthrights for weaker, less important storylines. For a lot of us, that storyline is the pursuit of power. Our own spiritual destructiveness makes us feel like we've been fumbled a kingdom that was supposed to come. Some of us have fallen captive to fear and are a shadow of who God once called us to be. Our souls are left to dream of a world and of a spirituality and of a church that could have been, but it just currently isn't. It's tragic. The state of spirituality in 2019, at least in the Western Hemisphere, is tragic. The American church across all denominations, it's tragic. I said this a few weeks ago. There's a lot of people writing about the church, pontificating about the changes that are on the horizon and that are coming. They've named this moment as a cultural shift. Now, I won't rehash the full argument. You can go back into our archives, listen to those sermons, but I will say this. The church gurus have acutely identified the problem. And I think they're right. We're in a real shift in terms of spirituality. The church in America is experiencing a real shift in how we practice religion. It's problematic in regards to weekly worship attendance and programming. and it's happening across all denominations. Now, I will say the Spirit of God is not diminishing, but church practice is shifting. And fear comes with the fact that there's not one guru who has a proven solution on what we do. We're just all in this together, experiencing a cultural shift. So are the Israelites, by the way. In Malachi, spirituality had significantly shifted for them. The monarchy was gone. They don't have a king to tell them what to do or how to worship anymore. The assumption that there was a chosen people of God, it no longer means the same thing. The cultural connection to the temple, which is now a shadow of what it used to be. It used to be 40 acres. The Temple Mount was huge, made of beautiful marble. Now it looks like a shack. The Second Temple period is nothing compared to what it once was. There is a cultural shift on what even the meaning of space is for Israel. A cultural shift literally ends the Old Testament narrative. It mirrors our situation today. Both of us are wondering, what do we do in the midst of this shift? The gurus don't have an answer. But I think it's because they haven't studied Malachi well enough. There is an answer to our woes and our fears in chapter 3. So I'm going to read it to you. Then I'm going to break down this point for several minutes. In about 11 minutes, you can be the judge as if the solution that Malachi offers is worthy enough for us to utilize to navigate this cultural shift. I'm going to start by reading the text and then explain it. Regardless, you're going to sit and listen for 11 more minutes. Let's read Malachi 3, verses 2 and 3. For he is like a refiner's fire, like a fuller's soap. He will sit as a refiner and purifier of silver. He will purify the descendants of Levi and refine them like gold and silver until they present offerings to the Lord in righteousness. Did you catch it? Here's the answer. Spiritual alchemy. That's a phrase you've probably never heard before. I want to break this down. Let's start with the word alchemy. This is a chemistry term. It's the idea that you can boil an element down in order to combine it with another element to then forge and fuse it to make a third new element. Think about forging a sword in fire. Blacksmiths engage in alchemical practices. Engineers do, artists do, sculptors do. Anybody can. With enough controlled heat, alchemy is the intentional burning of elements in order to make something new. Malachi calls this the refiner's fire. It's the same thing. Now take that idea in chemistry and apply it to your own spirituality. Your soul is a spiritual substance. By turning it over to the refiner, you can be purified. God is the refiner. Your soul is the substance, but it must be boiled down. It must be stripped of its diseased parts, forgiven for its collection of sin, and when it's purified, it is mixed with a new spiritual substance: love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, self-control. The fruits of the Spirit mix in and we become something new. We literally become a new creation. Over the last several years, I've experienced an intense spiritual alchemy. As you may have glimpsed by now, my personality has some character flaws. I know you're aware of it. I'm just becoming aware of it too. The biggest is I get fixated on achieving success. I get wildly wrapped up in it. It actually becomes the source of my self-confidence. If I'm not achieving, then my ego feels worthless. As long as I'm achieving, I feel safe. This usually means that I become very competitive in my daily life. I have to be in order to feel safe, which, when I'm not my best self, I'm very willing to lie or cheat or steal to come out on top. I can deceive even myself. I can trick my mind to think that winning is more important than playing by the rules. I can even change the narrative so a failure can be spun into a success. This is my root sin. I can create an image of accomplishment. I can deceive myself into thinking that I'm on top. I can present myself as a successful person, even when I have nothing to show for my actions. It is a real character flaw. In the 6th grade, I had the highest grade in all 6 of our classes. We had an awards ceremony where parents came, and I went home sad because I got the award for the highest grade in all 6 of the classes. I got to walk across stage 6 times to receive the biggest award. But I went home feeling like a failure because I did not get the perfect attendance award because of an orthodontist appointment that went terribly wrong. I fixated on the one missed achievement, even in the face of all of that success. So my ego has been at this for quite a while now. I feel like I'm an educated person. I feel like I'm self-aware enough to know that lying and cheating and stealing are not good habits to live into. But this flaw, it manifests itself in other ways too. I have learned to anticipate how someone could win. Oftentimes, I'll hunker down and isolate myself into my own head and my own thoughts until I can work out a way that makes sense to me to become more efficient at a task that hasn't even unfolded yet. So when the time comes to perform that task, I will have the mental advantage on whoever's competing against me to know that this process can be done a certain way. I use efficiency to fuel my ego to achieve success. I'll show you what I mean. In the 4th grade, we had timed multiplication tests. I would stress out about them, not because I didn't know the answers. I knew all the answers, but I had to be the first one in the class done with the test. I had to be the first to walk up to the teacher's desk and to place my finished test as if I had accomplished something no one else did. And every single time we took that test, I was the first one to finish. I had to be. My soul had to be. My ego demanded that I would be a failure, even if I got 100 and came in second. It's all ego. I valued efficiency even at an early age, and I got so fixated on it. This is why I love spiritual things like the Enneagram, which we'll study tonight at Sunday Night Live. It teaches me so much about how to identify my own sins. But truthfully, something that I have done a lot of work in, and I have learned this to be very true. My ego is not my sin, and neither is yours. Your ego is the natural unraveling of life. It's the skin that we put on to protect ourselves in a world that inflicts nothing but pain, and we feel the damage in our soul. The ego is the outer protective layer of our soul. We all have it, and we all need it. But what is sinful is ego fixation. My need to constantly achieve, to constantly win. That's my sin. Ego fixation is something that we all do, and it is devilishly hard to see in ourselves because it becomes the source of our self-acceptance. Ego fixation is the narrative that we tell ourselves in order to feel okay. The way my kind of ego feels satisfied is by receiving the praise of others. The easiest way to receive praise is by succeeding at things. And the more efficient I am at succeeding, the more praise I'll get and the more self-accepting I will feel in my ego. Do you see the damage that this cycle can produce? It's not ego, it's ego fixation. I used to be completely fixated outwardly. What does the world see when they see me? I thought about that all the time. It shaped the way I dressed and the way I wore my hair and the words that I would use to speak. It's why I felt bad about myself in middle school when I had acne or being overweight as a young adult. To overcome these insecurities, I always had to try to achieve something new. I may not be best at this, but I can be best at this, because if I'm successful, then I'm safe. Now, some of you understand exactly where I'm coming from. Others of you, I know exactly what you're thinking. Oh, Barrett is some kind of pathetic. And you're right. But you're just as bad. We all have fixations. We all sin. We are all wrestling with things that are devilishly hard to overcome. Our egos are not made in God's image, and we get fixated on them constantly. And then we start contributing to our own self-sabotage and our own sinful patterns. And since our egos are our own creations, they aren't everlasting. They fail us, and they have to be remade, sometimes daily, sometimes hourly. We remake ourselves in a new false image because we think we have to in order to survive, in order to feel safe. And that's the fixation. I didn't get it right this time, but next time I'll be better because I'll remake myself into this new person. The narrative that we constantly have on repeat is, if I'm blank, if I am good, if I am right, if I am successful, if I'm creative, if I can challenge authority, if I am peaceful, then I will be safe. And you're right. It is pathetic. And that's why it needs to be alchemized. To do this, we must become aware of our sins. We have to pay attention to our fixations. In order to know what God needs to boil down, we have to be able to name them and then hand them over to the refiner. But trust me when I say this. This kind of work is incredibly hard. And this is why church, in my opinion, is flailing during this cultural shift. This is why the answer hasn't readily appeared among all the gurus. Spiritual alchemy is hard. The church doesn't teach it. You can't stumble into a church anywhere in America and hear this narrative on repeat. And I think our culture has noticed. So they just stopped coming to church. Over the last 40 years, the church in the West has done a lot to elevate our ego fixation. We feed our ego fixation constantly. More music, more lights, more gadgets, more trendy colors, more talk of damnation, more hate, more hurt, more cover-ups, more complex or less complexity, less thought, less transcendence, less commitment, less studies, less debates, less disagreements, less community, and less dinners to gather around. Less has become more. And here's the great irony of church in the last 40 years. We have taken everything that could potentially be dangerous or studious in an attempt to keep our children safe. And they left the church anyway. In an effort to make everyone's egos feel safe, we have replaced spiritual alchemy and started feeding everyone's ego fixations. And the culture noticed. If the church wants to be a vital participant in the spiritual formation of the next generation, then we must start alchemizing ego fixation. And by the way, this was true in Malachi's day too. In chapter 3, verse 3, he will sit as a refiner's fire, a purifier of silver. He will purify even the descendants of Levi. Do you know who the descendants of Levi are? The Levites are the priestly class. There were 12 tribes of Judah. 11 of those tribes were given land. One tribe was not. They were called to be the priests of all the other tribes. That's the Levites. Malachi is talking to the religious leaders here. They, above anyone, need to invest in the refiner's fire. And here's what he says, continuing in verse 3. And the descendants of Levi, and they need to refine them like gold and silver until they present offerings to the Lord as righteousness. Verse 4. Then the offering of Judah and Jerusalem will be pleasing to the Lord in the days of old as in the former years. In other words, they will be alchemized, and they will start to look like the following. Verse 5. Then I will draw near to you, says God, for judgment. I will be swift to bear witness against the sorcerers, against the adulterers, against those who swear falsely, against those who oppress the hired workers for their wages. By the way, that's everyone giving in to ego fixation. The widow and the orphan, against those who thrust aside the alien, for those who don't fear me, says the Lord of hosts. If you're a bit confused about spiritual alchemy, I get it. It is a hard construct. It's not something we have been taught over the course of our lives. You're going to need to wrestle with this, spend time over lunch thinking about this, and I hope you will. Well, let me take one more lap at it. The parts of us that are most sinful, they have infiltrated into our church praxis. And we keep feeding them as if it is our saving grace. This was Israel's greatest sin during the 300 years of the book of the 12. They couldn't quit feeding their fixations. More power meant more money. More money meant more security. More security meant more prestige. What they left behind was more God. Church in America has done the exact same thing. Now, I'm not talking about First Baptist. I'm actually very proud of the type of church that we are, but we're still in the flow of this cultural shift. Churches everywhere, even the big ones, are guilty. We have replaced transformation and started pre-packaging and selling ego fixation. And here's the real kicker. When we constantly feed our ego fixation, we're capable of all kinds of sins, the deadliest of sins, like lust or gluttony or greed or sloth or wrath or envy, or perhaps the worst of all, pride. These sins become daily practices to the church. And you see it in the evangelical church. You see it in the Catholic church. You see it in the mainline Protestant church all the time. They are all fueled by ego fixation. And this is the church's root sin. And people who do not regularly go to the refiner's fire, they will breed nothing but sin. So how do we correct it? We have to alchemize. We have to do what the people in Malachi are asked to do. We have to ask questions of ourselves, to self-actualize, to self-reflect on our fixated patterns. We need to ask, how did we get here? How do we stop? How shall we return to the Lord? Then we must go through a spiritual refining where our ego fixation is sacrificed to God. We repent. God boils our confession of all of its deformities, At this point, we become malleable. God then mixes in the fruits of the Spirit. And that once egotistical, self-absorbed sin, it gets reworked and rebranded. It gets alchemized into grace. Malachi prophesies about this. He says this difficult work will be made easier when we go through the refiner's fire. And the good news is we don't have to do this hard work alone, because God is going to send a Messiah to show us how best we can be refined. That Messiah is Jesus. When we look to the life and the teachings of Jesus, which we're going to start doing next week, we will see a perfect example of a fully alchemized spirit. The best of ego and the best of spirit is bound up in the personhood of Jesus. And he is coming to earth to show us how to live. We must alchemize our ego fixation if we want to grow and to be like Christ. And to do this, we have to go through the refiner's fire. Otherwise, we're stuck in the same mindset that got us and the church and this cultural shift into this mess to begin with.